Hello everyone, and welcome to Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the artistic, creative side of the tracks, from indie to AAA. My name's John, I'm your host. I'm a journalist based out in Reykjavik, Iceland, and this episode we have something a bit special for you. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you might remember all the way back on episode 8, around April last year, when I was just starting out the show, and I reviewed a game called In Other Waters, a fascinating underwater narrative-based adventure, a wonderful, crisp graphical UI, and a rich ecosystem all laid out for you to explore under the waves of an alien planet. I loved it at the time, and it stuck with me all year actually. The mood of it is just wonderful, and it was such a relaxing game to play at such a stressful time, with this beautiful music by Amos Roddy that you can hear now, and it invites you into a really enticing and well-written adventure where you explore the bottom of an ocean, taking samples from plants and the life forms that are down there, and discovering this ecosystem that's at the core of the game. It went on to be one of my top 5 games of the year, so I spoke about it again more recently in one of the Games of the Year episodes. It was the one that I did with Louis from Time Played 3HR podcast. This episode, I talked to the creator of that game, a solo developer called Gareth Damian Martin, also the editor of the Heterotopias zine, a really nice online zine about games and architectural spaces, but it expands on that in lots of different directions. It's a really good read, and Gareth is an interesting person with a lot of cool things going on, so I'm really happy that Gareth agreed to be on the show as our first game developer guest. But before the interview, as is customary on the show, I thought I'd tell you just what I've been playing in the last week and what's been going on. I've been playing a lot more of Immortals Fenyx Rising, actually, the Ubisoft open world game that's closely comparable to the latter-day Assassin's Creeds and to Breath of the Wild. I also think it's got quite a strong dash of sort of childlike Disney humour in it as well. But I've been surprised, the further that I get into it, how much fun I'm having with it. It really is very enjoyable. It feels like Ubisoft is starting to break the back of the constraints of their own formula in the last couple of games. People who've played Assassin's Creed Valhalla say that it's a huge leap forward that addresses a lot of the glaring flaws of Odyssey. And Fenyx does too, I think. There's a variety of tasks that you can do, enough to keep you busy all the time without feeling too much repetition. It feels like the tasks are woven together with the progression through the story very well. So I'm having a lot of fun with that, and I'm going to have a talk with Adam from Switch Indie Fix for a podcast about it in the near future. I've also been playing a little bit of Going Under. It's a game that I've wanted to try for a while. It's got a very attractive art style to it. It's a roguelike based on a satirical take on startup culture. So you go into a new job, a new internship rather, and you're supposed to be doing marketing, but on your first day you're sent down to a dungeon to clear it of the monsters that have been infesting the building. And it's a roguelike, so it's run based. You get a little bit further every time you go through it, and the lay of the land changes, so it's fresh every time. You learn more about the different power-ups that are available and the different combinations of assets that you can use. The fun thing about this one is that you're moving through office environments, at least in the first worlds, and you can use anything you can lay your hands on as a weapon. So you end up using staplers, monitors, keyboards, and as you take out the goblins that live down there, you also pick up their weapons, and so you end up with a huge array of stuff that you're always having to just pick up, use, and then it breaks very quickly. But I've been having a lot of fun with it actually. It's quite addictive. And for someone that wasn't really into roguelikes, I think I'm starting to come around a little bit. Perhaps Hades will turn out to be the narrow end of the wedge when it comes to me appreciating roguelikes. I will also mention that Gaming in the Wild is listener supported. I have an account on Patreon, an account on Ko-Fi. If you are interested in supporting the show, either as a first-time listener today or as someone who checks out the show every week, you can go to patreon.com/gaminginthewild to support the show with as little as $1 a month. It all counts, it all adds up. It helps me to get better equipment to make the show sound better. It helps me to source more games to cover. And it's just generally a good boost to the show to know that people are out there listening and want to support me. So if you're interested in that, patreon.com/gaminginthewild or ko-fi.com/gaminginthewild for a one-off tip. And thank you to anyone that fancies doing that. There are benefits to being a patron. You'll get extra episodes, you'll get an invite to our Discord chat server, where you can talk to me and to other listeners of the show and swap game tips and screenshots and so forth. I also run sale recommendations, so if you don't have a lot of time to sort through the Switch and PlayStation sales, I do a little rundown every week of the best games that are available, PlayStation and Switch, for a cut price, especially games that have been featured on the show. Often there are great indie games buried in, page 17 or whatever. So if you don't have a lot of time for shoveling through all of those sale pages, you'll be able to make back that membership fee in no time at all. And thank you very much to everyone that supports the show. I really appreciate everyone who does. And with that said, let's move on to our feature of the week, which is an interview with Gareth, Damian, Martin. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, I'm really happy to welcome to the show today Gareth, Damian, Martin, the designer of In Other Waters. Hello, Gareth.
Hey there.
Thanks very much for joining us. In Other Waters was a game that I was sent to review by an editor of mine at Switch Indie Fix, and I hadn't heard of it previously, and I was so happy to play it. I spent a good 10 hours in a very ambient, kind of relaxed mood with it on a big screen and nice big speakers. So it was a really lovely game experience, and it's nice to talk to you about it now. I wondered if we could begin, actually, because you have such an interesting range of stuff that you do as a writer, an artist, and a game designer, and some other stuff with Heterotopias magazine and so forth. I wonder if you could just explain what your range of activities is.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it might be a little tricky. I'll try and make sure I include it all. But yeah, I tend to get bored with things and do lots of things. So apart from making games as Jump Over the Age, which is my solo development studio, which I was the umbrella studio for In Other Waters, I also have been a games critic for 10 or so years, and as part of that I started my own publication called Heterotopias, which is a zine about games and architecture, where it's basically began as an excuse for me to write about games and architecture because there wasn't many places I could do that, and then it turned out lots of other people wanted to do that too, so I just kind of started to bring in more and more people to come write pieces for it, and that's kind of grown into its own self-sustaining beast, which has been really nice and totally not what I was expecting when I, late one night, annoyed with the current publication I was working for, I just sent an email to a couple of my friends and said, I'll pay you if you'll write a thing about games and architecture for the new magazine I just invented. I definitely didn't expect that to then go on for heading for 8. It'll be the 8th issue this year. So, yeah, no, that's been really nice. And then, I have a very mixed background. I studied puppetry at university, which is a strange thing to study. You won't meet many people who've studied puppetry at university, but at a theatre school. But I've done a PhD in experimental literature, in poetry, a few years back, and that was kind of when I was thinking about what I'm going to do after the PhD, and I thought I'd take a shot at making some games because I've been writing about games for many years, and I'd worked as a graphic designer and a motion designer as well. So games seemed like a really nice place for me to bring together a lot of the things I did, writing and graphic and visual design, and my interest in the medium. So yeah, and that In Other Waters was kind of born out of that, and much like Heterotopias, I ran a Kickstarter for it, and it turned out to be kind of more successful than I imagined, because publisher got in touch with me. A few publishers got in touch with me, and I ended up signing with Fellow Traveller, who've been great, and yeah, the rest is history, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see how that game bridges the stuff that you do with the kind of very graphical look of it on the screen, but then this very dense and juicy world that's delivered mostly via text. So, as a designer and a writer, I can see, and also it does have some architecture in it, although it's in a blueprint kind of sense, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about kind of architecture in games, one of the main things in Heterotopias is kind of this idea that games are just inherently architecture, even because they're built space. So even if it's a landscape, then it still kind of relates to built space as opposed to natural space in a way. So yeah, but that is the one thing about In Other Waters that perhaps people might not have expected from me, that perhaps they would expect something that was a bit more urban or kind of related to my work with architecture in games. But I think that my interest in maps definitely as storytelling devices is, I think, a big part of what led me to make In Other Waters.
Mm-hmm. Right. One of the first things that I think I wrote this in the review, actually, when you described the game to people as this underwater science fiction story in which you navigate an interesting alien world and take samples and learn about the lay of the land and the ecosystem of that and engage in a story. I think if you just say that to people, that the game that comes into their mind is probably somewhere between Subnautica and Abzu or something like that, like a very exploratory and very kind of probably first-person exploration game. So it's such a decision to take it the way that you did with the topographical maps and the kind of the AI graphical interface, user interface. So one of the things that I was curious to ask you about actually is when you first started to conceive of the game, I was curious about the process of that. What came first? Was it the ecosystem or the kind of the interface, and how did it all slot together as a process of thinking it up?
Sure, yeah. I think it's a very particular moment that the game kind of started to exist, which was, even though it includes there's a lot of small experiments I made previously with maps and top-down views and bits of text, and I was making a lot of small experimental games. I was also making games in Twine and kind of text games. But in the summer of 2017, I spent some time in the Aegean, just near the Aegean Sea, near Thessaloniki in Greece. And I stayed in a place that had the direct path down into the sea. And so I was kind of swimming in the sea every day. And ever since I was a kid, I've been absolutely fascinated by sea life and the ocean. And so this was kind of it was a wonderful trip. But while I was there, it was just before I was turning 30. And one of the things I'd kind of got in my head was this idea that I wanted to make a game as a kind of present for myself for my 30th birthday. And so I had this idea of experimenting with how I could take the text game work that I already did, and how I could slowly kind of introduce other elements to that. And I made an interactive fiction game just after I got back from that trip called Salt, where you swim by pressing the space bar, and the longer you swim, the more the text auto plays. But if you stop, it gets harder and harder to swim, and because of there's kind of a decreasing bar all the time like this, and you have to hit space and time. Then you come back up to the surface and you kind of lose the train of thought, and you can dive back down and swim again. And this was like a very early experiment with thinking about how can I make a text game that kind of brings in bits of graphic design and something very simple and some simple mechanics and tries to do something. But at the same time, while I was on that trip, I had this idea kind of pop fully fledged into my head of being an AI inside the diving suit of a diver. Not necessarily a biologist then, but it just seemed like the most obvious way to bring together text and little widgety kind of UI, kind of anime UI, and I'm a massive fan of Alien, the original Alien, and all the kind of production design of that. And it just felt like a really nice way to bring together all of those things into quite a neat little package. And so I think it felt like it just popped into my head, and it was one of those ideas where it's so good that you kind of are compelled to do it. That you kind of feel that, well, I've just had this idea and it really works. I can see it straight away. I thought, okay, this is the one. I'm gonna go for this. So then it was a case of iteration. It started off, with a big text panel and some small little, which you can kind of see the nascent parts of in the final game, but like the screen was mostly text. With some little kind of widgets down the side, little circular widgets with oxygen and power that you had to kind of keep an eye on while you were playing essentially a choose your own adventure game. But as I developed the game, the text panel kind of got smaller and smaller and smaller and got shoved out as I started to add more and more interesting kind of modular widgets and started to pack in a compass and then maps and then, oxygen and power and then additional sampling, and all these ideas started to come in, and the text kind of got pushed off to the side. And that's where it kind of all started to come together. And I think the final kind of realization that really brought the game together was me realizing that all the text in the game should be written by Ellery Vass, the main character. That originally the game had a kind of Metroid Prime-like scanning idea that you kind of scan something and then some kind of other, who writes the scan entries in Metroid Prime? I don't know. I don't know who gets there before Samus and kind of makes a documentary, makes a Wikipedia for her to then uncover herself.
It's old Grandma Aran who's been doing the same stuff.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a question you're never supposed to ask, like who wrote the scan visor entries. But that started to annoy me more and more the more I played the game. And yeah, so I was like, okay, well, what if she was writing anything? And suddenly the game became really intimate and really interesting. The idea that you have one character, almost everything that you read, there's only a tiny, tiny few messages and things that are written by other characters. Almost everything else is written by one person, which is kind of very weird for a game. And so, yeah, all those things and that's kind of how it came together, really, in a very iterative way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, I had to obviously take a swing at describing this game as part of the review, and it does take a little bit of focus to get the idea across that you're not the protagonist of the game, perhaps, or, I mean, maybe you are, but the main protagonist of the game is the human doctor, Ellery Vass, xenobiologist, exploring the alien ocean, and that you are basically her kind of digital assistant in the beginning. And so the way that you are seeing the world, it starts to click into place, I think, the more that you play. The fact that you're seeing this kind of cold, topographical interface in the way in which you're understanding that world sort of chimes with the fact that you're playing as an AI. So, of course, you're not seeing the kind of the things that Ellery is describing to you, like the spores and the forests and the stalk forests and different creatures. So it does make sense in that way that you're experiencing this, but then it's such an interesting chain of stuff because you're a human who is playing as an AI who is understanding the world through a human. So it's like the AI is the thing in the middle between you and Ellery in a way, and that's the filter through which you see the world. It's documents, it's transcriptions, it's texts, it's samples, it's blueprints of a base rather than walking through it, which is, I guess, again quite different to other games like Observation that use this idea of playing as the AI that can kind of use cameras to see or things like that. But it's an interesting setup, and the coldness of it, of the graphical UI, is offset by the intimacy of the relationship with Ellery for sure. It feels very human, and yet you can't kind of reach out and touch Ellery, or you can't really see Ellery, but she's very much there, just this kind of soft voice describing the world to you throughout the game. It's a really nice setup.
Yeah, I think that distance is something that I really wanted to explore in the game, and it's something that I kind of picked up bits and pieces from a lot of In Other Waters is about me picking up bits and pieces from other games that I like. I guess this comes from being a critic and kind of trying to take a tiny bit of them and explode it outwards. So, in a way, one way I can sometimes describe In Other Waters is that I was trying to make Destiny if Destiny was just the map. Or because I just thought I loved those maps in that game, and I was like, why do we need anything more? We've got these beautiful maps. Let's just make a game based on this. And I think one of the games that I kind of drew out that relationship from, or there's kind of two games in a way, which is one is Duskers, which is this wonderful game where you play a drone operator, kind of at the end of the world in a destroyed end of the universe, in this destroyed kind of junkyard of ships, sending out your drones into ships, trying to get resources to keep you alive while aliens patrol the ships, and it's all played by command line. And it creates this really wonderful sense of relationship with your drones, even though the drones are completely kind of they're automated, and you give them commands because they all have their own little beeps and they all have a randomly generated name, and you, because you feel so distant and you feel, because you're implicated in the game, because in a way the game's kind of virtual reality in the sense that you're playing someone who's sat at a computer typing on a keyboard, so you're playing yourself. That it creates this really nice tension that gives you something to fill with your emotion and your desire. And that was something really important within Other Waters, was to try and frustrate that relationship between you and Ellery a little bit, and to try and give, but also create a space where you know, really wanted people to talk to Ellery while they're playing the game, you know, from their own mouth, you know, in the playing in the room of the, because they can't talk in the game, they can only say yes or no, and only at certain times. So just trying to always to push that and to encourage that. So I think that balance of distance and intimacy was really important to me in the game.
Another thing that catches the attention straight away is, I remember that experience of Metroid Prime that you're talking about. It was actually my favourite part of that game by far, and the part that I was most entranced by was moving through this natural space and feeling the wonder of it, and to be able to extract all of this information from the things around you through the augmented reality of the helmet setup there. I was almost sad when I had to fight space pirates or whatever, and just wanted to go back to my biology research. So I guess it's nice that this game allows you to do so. But the ecosystem in the game itself, it's quite wonderful. I was quite curious about how much of this, because it scans when you're reading it. It could well be, you know, I'm not particularly familiar with marine biology, but if someone presented this to me and told me this exists in the world, I would buy it in a second, that there were these spore clusters under the water doing all of this stuff. I was playing the game to kind of refresh myself about it, because I played it a year ago now. I discovered these stalk scrapers, chitin-based, containing glucose and high levels of polysaccharides, and they consume stalk membrane as a vital substance for their shell formation. And I thought, wow, that's it's so detailed and scientific in tone. I was wondering, like, about the combination of research of existing processes in the Earth's ecosystem and the purely imagined aspect of this planet.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of when I began making In Other Waters, and I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to make a game, and I know that takes like 2 or 3 years, so I've got to think of something that I'll be happy to research for 2 to 3 years. And the first thing for me was like, well, I've kind of like, if I hadn't wanted to be an artist, I would have wanted to be a marine biologist. So I was like, this is a great, I bought like what an undergrad student, a marine biology student would buy, kind of tome of reference material, and went through that. And a big part of In Other Waters as a game is I really wanted it to reflect back on our world and our the marine life on our planet, because I think there's often this thing with aliens where it's like, well, the search for sentient life, and it's like, well, we have sentient life here, you know, depending on your definition of sentience. But if you start to do some research into kind of the brains of sperm whales and the way they talk to each other with a kind of 3D sound language and things like this, and you're like, well, this is far more interesting than anything I can imagine. And so a lot of In Other Waters was me kind of pulling out interesting elements from evolution, and and from real biology, and then trying to massage them in kind of interesting directions. So the stalk forest is inspired by the fungal networks which exist in our own forests, the networks of hyphae, which have kind of been described as the internet of trees by some biologists. And yeah, I think like there's so much material for us to draw on. You kind of discover even the humble limpet its shell is made of one of the hardest natural substances that exists, and you kind of think, well, if I could find that, or what, the microbes you can find in the liver of a catfish, or so. The more I read, the more I found material. And the key thing within the waters to help me build the ecosystem was just to impose limits, because all kind of evolution comes out of a negotiation with the environment. And so I just imagined different ecosystems that I wanted to explore in the game. So the toxic bloom, the deep brine pools, and I just kind of followed the logic of what might exist there. How could it exist? What implications do these environments have, and then what interests me, and and it just kind of came naturally and was really enjoyable. I think I always tried to balance it also, not to just make it feel like an endless tome of, even though I write this stuff, I mostly when I play an RPG and one of these lore books comes up, I don't read it because it looks far too long for me to bother with. And it's presented in a way that's like the history of Ferelden, or the history of, it's kind of like flat. And so the key thing for Into the Waters is I was all the time trying to think of the themes of the game, the themes of symbiosis, the experience of Ellery, and trying to keep everything kind of relative to that, so that even if you're reading an encyclopedia, the encyclopedia somehow tells you something about the protagonist in a way.
Yeah, it's nice the way that it's delivered to you. I mean, I've come across games like that too. For example, someone bought me Myst to a Christmas because I hadn't played it, and they were a little outraged. And I don't think I've ever sat down and read so much in a game, because there's just a library that you have to read before you can play, basically. And it's, flipping pages and reading this guy's diary. But in Other Waters, it's really nicely structured in that as you collect samples or have sightings of animals, Ellery will collect this data slowly, and it collates. And I love the way that it comes kind of episodically, so it's like your reward for the work you've done to get the text, rather than being in Myst, like told to read a book before you can go and do the fun stuff. So I was always really happy to get my new taxonomy entries. You kind of really sugared the pill with the reading in the game there.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad. I think that another kind of inspiration or idea comes from like the Mass Effect galaxy map, which I always loved, because I think that it just has just enough information on each planet and just enough visual information on the planet that you can kind of, just reading a tiny little part of history and seeing the little orb of the planet is enough, really. You can ping off to another planet and read something else, and it has a lot of restraint, but it gives you a lot of space to fill it in yourself.
Yeah, and the final entry that you get in each taxonomical entry, obviously, is the sketch, which felt like a real kind of a cherry on the cake every time I would get a sketch. Again, I think partially because of the way that you're experiencing the world through the AI kind of interface, the user interface that you get, to see something that was hand-drawn by Ellery, because of that lack of tactile aspects to your relationship. It's so nice to see something that was hand-drawn by Ellery, because it really makes you feel connected to her almost more than anything else in a way.
Yeah, I'm really glad that comes through. I think the sketch is a kind of tentative thing, because some people bounce off it. I think they feel that after all this reading about something, to be shown a picture of it can be kind of disjunctive. It can give you that weird feeling of, well, that's not what I was imagining. But for me personally, I have such a love of sketches of bestiaries in games and books and stories, and it's such a draw for me. And then the idea of having that again be like, in the hand of a character and tell you something, or give you some connection to that character, just felt too good to pass up, really. So I had a lot of fun drawing those and kind of trying to think about Ellery while I did them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was very much like that too. I was like, that's not what I expected that to look like, but it was more like, oh, so that's what it's like, and just sitting looking at that, kind of matching it with the picture in your mind. You know what I mean? It was like it was a fun moment every time.
Yeah, it was a huge volume of descriptive work, really, for the game. That even if I hadn't put those sketches in, I think I would have had to draw the animals in order to describe them, because I described them so many times, and I described the ocean so often and so in such detail that I kind of, for me personally, I'm such a visually minded person that I need those sketches in my head to work from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the ways that I've described the game to people is as an extremely visual text adventure, because most of the kind of material that you're getting is text, but the way that you navigate through that information, it did give me a flashback to playing like some of the first video games that I ever played, such as Sphinx Adventure way back in the early 80s on the Acorn Electron, where you're walking through a desert and walking through different environments and just choosing to go north, south, east and west. It was just a classic, pure, plain text adventure. And so it was. I felt like it was a very neat way to take the text adventure and to draw it into this millennium, kind of. Were text adventures something that were on your mind, or that you've played yourself?
I'm not a particular text adventure kind of fan in a way, which seems very strange to make this game and not be a kind of big text adventure person. I think that I'm more inspired by science fiction literature than I am necessarily by text adventures. I kind of was a kid, like I guess many of my generation, who had like choose your own adventure books and all of that, and I really enjoyed text in games. But I think that text in games has a very particular quality. Like you say, I obsessively read the Metro Prime Scan stuff, obsessively read Mass Effect's galaxy map. The lore in Destiny, the kind of just kind of endless books, novels worth just spread out throughout the game. But there's something particular about the way in which text in games is kind of atomized and mixed around and arranged in kind of interesting ways that I think I found attractive. And that was kind of the two parts of In Other Waters, really, is you have this very linear story, but I always wanted the player to be able to engage with the more fragmented, like little bits of text that are everywhere and in their own order or in their own way based on their own interest. And so I think that while there is that obvious kind of sense of it being a text adventure reimagined for maybe a new audience, I think that it's also kind of I kind of in my head thought of it like an exploded science fiction novel, because I think that, for example, the game doesn't really care about branching, and that's something that I'm not. It's not a massive part of what I like to do. Is kind of explore the idea of branching text, where you take the left path or the right path. For me, I don't. I think that can be really amazing, but it's just not something that I'm interested in exploring personally. So I kind of the game is kind of balanced between a lot of different elements there, I guess. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily have those traditional elements of like, well, if you say this to Ellery, then that will push you towards this kind of ending or that kind of ending, or the game kind of takes its toll. But I like this. I'm more interested in text in games as the reward, as the kind of the same as the Uncharted Vista. That when you get to the top of the bit of climbing that you've done 500 times before, the reason you do it is because you get this beautiful view, and then you sit there and enjoy the beautiful view. And I think text can have that same role. And I think we see that more and more in games like Hades, for example, kind of really make use of the idea of text as a reward, narrative as a reward. So, yeah, I think I'm not necessarily a traditional text adventure kind of developer.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to go back to it now. I think I played through it in 9 hours the first time, and I felt like I had stuck pretty close to the narrative path for the duration of that, and then discovered that on How Long to Beat, people said that 6 hours was the most common time that people played through it. And when I went back to it today, I realised that there are still kind of 8 dots pinging on the map and samples that I can still get that I'd kind of managed to somehow miss, or that had come up later. So it's interesting that you can kind of move through this game and you can attempt to take the critical path of the story, of the missing person story that is at the core of the plot line, and then still have all of this stuff to come back to and to revisit that world. I was kind of glad that it was there today to be able to go back in and discover more.
Yeah, I think that's very important for me from a design perspective. I think I'm a big part of my kind of relationship with architecture and game spaces is that I just love to idle in games and I love to spend time just hanging out in them. And so when I came to make a game, I wanted to make sure that you always had that opportunity to spend a bit more time there, to try and give the player as many excuses to go back, but also to give them that kind of that Firewatch like kind of very linear path. But I think it's very telling that after a bit of player pressure, Firewatch added that kind of weird free roam, and I think that's because people really want to hang out in games and to be in those spaces. So yeah, I enjoy kind of providing busy work and activities for people to do, so that if they really like the game and they like the atmosphere, they've got a reason to kind of stay there and put another hour or two in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was definitely the case today. It felt like just a day at the office for Ellery, actually. The main story was over, but we were going out into the ocean to just find the samples we needed for our taxonomy and just doing the work of the marine xenobiologist. Yeah.
I mean, I love banality in games. I love kind of doing a job in games. I just started playing Nuts, and that has that wonderful quality of doing a job, just documenting the squirrels. I think it can be really powerful, and yeah, it's a way of getting away from perhaps some of the traditional limits of games and their kind of hero stories. Is if you can just give people a space to do a job. I think that can be quite fun.
Mm-hmm. Right, and of course there is the kind of the main thrust of the narrative of the story, which I guess we'll talk about a little without spoiling it for people that haven't played In Other Waters yet. But it does kind of, as you said, as an exploded science fiction novel. That's a good, nice way to describe it, because it's a plot line that sci-fi fans will really enjoy, and there is a story to be told there. There is an investigation to take place. There is a mystery, and there are larger forces at play. And it was nice to kind of be able to move through that world and do the xenobiologist's work, whilst at the same time advancing this storyline to get down to the brass tacks of what was happening. I keep circling around saying the name of the planet, I've realised, because I don't want to pronounce it wrong. How do we pronounce Glyce? Is it Glyce? Is it Gleese?
Gleese. I think it's Gleese. I have to admit that I'm not an expert at pronouncing planets. I do find it very entertaining though, because it's obvious Gleese is a, I don't know if you know this, but it's a telescope really. It's the name of all the planets, all the systems that were discovered by a certain telescope. They're all called Gleese. Mm-hmm. But I enjoy that when people talk about In Other Waters, sometimes they don't know that, and they refer to the life as Gleesian, or they refer to the planet as Gleese on its own. Mm-hmm. But it is Gleese 667 CC. Mm-hmm. Which means that it is the CC is about it being the second planet of a binary system, and 667 is the star. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a real planet, which is fun. Another part of me kind of imposing limits on my by choosing something that really exists, you can at least you have a starting point rather than just imagining it from nothing. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so is it the imagined characteristics of a? Did you find a planet that was in the kind of the cozy zone where it might actually have water going on and life happening?
Yeah, I mean it's a classic. It's a bit self-referential as well, because it's a classic planet. I think Alien versus Predator goes there, and a few other science fiction novels go there, because at one point it was the imagined best chance of a kind of another Earth. I think in time it's actually it's tidally locked, which means that it one side of it always faces its sun, or its two suns, which means that it probably doesn't have. I don't know. There's lots of open questions about whether or not it would have an ocean, how that ocean would exist. But those things are all kind of in the game. I don't really talk about it much in the game, but it's kind of part of the ecosystem again. The idea of like, there's lots of kind of mechanics of what might have been happening on the planet beforehand as well, and things like that. It just gives me material to feed off rather than necessarily being very super hard science fiction that's super accurate.
Yeah, it seems like the rabbit hole could just go forever. Like, the kind of the geology of it and the kind of the amount of research that one could do to bring this planet to life, it just seems like, yeah, I can see why you impose some restraints on yourself to kind of to know when to stop in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of generative constraints. That is limits which help you create. I'm always doing that to myself, kind of forcing myself down, and that's why I find the research behind science fiction helpful. It's not because I don't like Star Wars and the idea where you're just like, well, spaceships are just cars that fly, that can park on a planet and park on another planet.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we don't need to explain why we have gravity or any of those other things. I don't mind that at all. I'll happily watch it myself. But when it comes to me and creating things, I find it almost impossible to make something in that context because I don't know what the limits are or what the context is. So I find it really helpful to be like, well, I'm going to choose a real planet. It's tidally locked, and then I'm going to choose some real ecosystems. They're going to have real conditions. I'm going to choose some real biology, and all of that. Suddenly, half the decisions are made for me, so I can just kind of do the nice colouring in bit at the end, really.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it does have a texture as you're moving through it. I think that the fact that it does have this kind of the research that you've done, like as I was reading out that taxonomy entry just before, I think the fact that it all sounds like it all seems plausible, and there's a logic in how this ecosystem interacts. And how the animals kind of use the plants and the plants use the animals around them and all of that sort of stuff. And it does give it this kind of texture of being something that you can buy into and something that you can believe. And that actually goes a really long way in, I think, especially in a game like this, with the interface that it has to draw you along on the journey and to make you buy into the scenario, So I think it worked out.
Yeah. I'm really glad. I think, for me, the thing that I realized was that if I was going to ask the player to engage with the world in this way, there needed to be enough for them to play at, to pick at. When you have to, In other words, is a game where you can't go somewhere unless I've described it, and that's actually quite a challenge. There's literally over 1,000 nodes in the game. So there's a huge volume of small descriptive writing about rocks or types of rocks. And so, you can't just describe, let's go to that rock over there. You quickly learn that, what's the difference between that rock over there and the rock over there? So you suddenly have to start thinking about what kind of rocks are there and what kind of things might be interesting about them and what kind of processes there are. And so, in a way, I also had to kind of research the geology or invent a geology of the planet, even if I had to invent so many things that I never really even say in the game, because they needed to be present by their absence. They needed to be felt, that you needed to feel that they were there, that there was something behind all of this writing you were reading, mm-hmm. even if I might not ever give you the 100% of the information. I might not just lay it out for you, because mm-hmm. I think otherwise you just lose energy to read this kind of stuff.
Right.
And I lose energy to write it. I can't endlessly describe rocks, but I had to find ways to make it interesting for me and the player, and that became a very generative challenge. It became a challenge that created a lot of the texture and feeling of the game, and a lot of the material just kind of came out of that need in a way.
I also wanted to ask you about the release of this game and how it went as well. Is it the first game that you've commercially released, apart from the earlier experiments that you were describing and stuff like that?
It is, yeah. Yeah, they were just all kind of free little things and competition entries and game jams and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, this was my first commercial game.
Mm-hmm. So that's another thing to navigate along with the geology, the potential geology of Gliese 667cc. Is how to release a game. I wanted to ask you about the experience of doing that, about the kind of the process of learning the ropes of that, and of working alongside fellow traveller and kind of getting the game onto different systems and things like. I assume that the game was designed with a mouse in mind and then mapped onto controllers later on, or was that something that came alongside it? And these kind of questions.
Yeah, that was a real challenge for sure. The Switch port. I think it's, especially for a first game. And I should say that I'm not a programmer. I didn't write a single line of code in Another Waters. Most of it is built with a visual scripting system called Playmaker, which is incredibly powerful, but has certain limitations when it comes to dealing with certain things that you kind of would want to write in code, basically. So I did have a programmer to help me with some stuff. But the process of launching the game was and porting the game was very challenging, but I kept it very close to my chest, which I think helped a lot. I am aware of a lot of games that kind of get sent out to porting houses, and I think if you make a traditional game, then I can see why you would give it to somebody else and say, okay, just port this onto Switch. Mm-hmm. It was just impossible for Another Waters, really. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of time spent between me and my programmer, Chris Payne, who worked on the Switch port, just kind of working out like how are we going to map this to the controller, and we had to create this kind of system where you can shuttle the focus onto different parts of the UI, and how can you still express that same feeling at the beginning of the game of looking at a computer system and not knowing how to interact with it when all the buttons are labeled with labels and extra labels for the letters. So yeah, it was really challenging, but I love the game on Switch. I love having it on Switch, and I was so eager to do it because it just felt like with the minimalist color, the focus on graphic design, the sense of having a little device in your pocket that could give you a portal into a little alien world of text and mm-hmm. leaping dots just seemed too good to pass up, really, for me. Mm-hmm. And I also had the feeling that if the game crashes and I don't make any money out of it, at least I will have released a game on a Nintendo console. As a Nintendo kid, it's one of those things you're like, this might be my one shot, so I'll take it.
Right.
But thankfully, it's not at all my one shot. And Fellow Traveller are incredibly good. I was very lucky to work with Fellow Traveller, I think, because when I signed with them, they were Surprise Attack, and they were just in the process of rebranding as a kind of narrative game publisher, and I got to be one of the vanguard of that, along with NeoCab and Where the Goats Are, or is it called The Stillness of the Wind? No, Stillness of the Wind.
Yeah.
The second. Koyan's gonna kill me. But yeah, I got really lucky to be part of that group, really, and to be part of a kind of a publisher's attempt to do something a bit different, and that was wonderful, and they really did a good job of finding the audience. I was also very lucky, having been a games critic. I think I managed to kind of get through the noise and to be seen by other critics, which is a huge advantage if you've worked in the games press, I think. Mm-hmm. That people know you and they kind of are interested in what you're doing. So the launch has been very successful, and I'm currently plugging away at game 2. It was a great experience. It was very hardcore. I launched in April of 2020, which is a kind of infamous month now. So mm-hmm. It was strange. And after spending 2 years cooped up in my home office, I was ready to go out and see the world, but unfortunately, everyone just came to join me as the pandemic arrived. So suddenly, everybody mm-hmm. else was working at home instead. So that was a challenge for sure, and made it hard to take a break. But no, I couldn't be happier with how it's gone. And since then, we've released in Chinese and Japanese as well, just at the end of last year, and that's gone really well. The game seems to connect with those audiences as well, which is great. Mm-hmm. We had a great localization team and a lot of fun with the localization team, as you might imagine, trying to figure out how you localize creature names. I still wish I could read the Japanese creature names, because I'm sure they must be wonderful. Mm-hmm. We had an absolutely wonderful localizer, and I just know that there's lots of in-jokes and playful uses of language in the way those creatures have been named.
Mm-hmm. Because I did see this game obviously do quite well with reviews, and it seemed to be well regarded. It was all kind of 8s, 9s out of 10, and really widely written about. And a couple of them actually called out the fact that it had come along at that point at the start of the pandemic. And I was playing this game for like 2 or 3 hours a night for 3 nights in a row, because obviously I was on a schedule to review it. And it was kind of a perfect kind of before bed game in a way. You're just looking at a lot of beautiful colours and listening to that gorgeous soundtrack, and just traveling around on dots, and it's so mellow and it moves at such a kind of a purposeful speed that it perhaps was like the exact right kind of game, much in the kind of, people wanted the Animal Crossings and things like that to kind of calm down their busy minds during that time, and maybe In Other Waters kind of hit the spot at that moment.
Yeah, I think, that's been a really nice thing to see, because the weird thing about the game is I had somebody, one of the PR guys we worked with, describe it as the ASMR of gaming, and I'd never really intended it, the whole time. I think maybe Amos Roddy, the composer, had a much more stronger sense of this than I did, because his work is very supportive of this kind of ambient experience. But in my head, I was kind of always focused on the narrative and the story and the writing I liked the methodical action, and I wanted to make something methodical. That engaged with the idea of work and study, and what work and study actually look like. But it was very nice to find that people found that very soothing. And although another podcast has accused it of being the sleepiest game, I think that as long as you're awake enough when you play it, hopefully it doesn't put people totally to sleep. But yeah, I think that, again, being on Switch, it's the idea. I have to admit that it definitely keeps me warm at night to imagine people under their bed covers with their Switch playing this game. I think that was, that's just a kind of lovely idea for me. And if it can give people that, I think Rock Paper Shotgun, Alice B's review of the game kind of really focused on this idea of also methodical progress, and that the game gave an opportunity to make progress in a kind of structured and methodical way, in a way that kind of gave a soft sense of wonder rather than trying to wow you all the time. And yeah, I was really happy to see that come through, and kind of connect to people and give them that space. I think I've had a few emails from people who have had COVID, or been stuck inside in the pandemic, and have said that the game was very important to them. And that's, you can't hope for anything more than to provide those kind of spaces for people, really, when you make a game.
I assume that's the Short Game podcast that you were talking about there.
Yes.
I listen to them, and we talk a lot on Discord and stuff, and I can say that Reagan and Shane, if they're listening, wouldn't mind me saying that they've both had babies recently, and so they're probably in need of a good sleep anyway, to be honest. So maybe it was useful to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair enough, really. I've had a young daughter this whole time for the process, and I very much understand the feeling of only gaming when tired. It's definitely a very particular vibe.
Yeah, nice to get that feedback as well. I mean, I imagine that when you put things out into the world, there is the kind of the critical response that you can kind of comb through. But I imagine that getting kind of genuine emails from people that have played it and felt moved to write to you would be a very satisfying part of that.
Yeah, and I think also the critical response, I was very anxious about the critical response, because I know that it's a game that does not make it doesn't necessarily make it, in my opinion, even as the person who made it, make it easy for you to love. It asks some things of you, and it puts some barriers in the way, and asks you to engage with them. And I think it is there. There are so few critics who really just kind of, and the same with Steam reviews, actually. There's so few where people really kind of just came out and said, "Oh, it's just too boring. It's just too slow. I don't like it." I was so pleased with that. I was so amazed. I had this idea that we were going to get absolutely slaughtered in any kind of user review, because there will be a lot of people who are angry that the game wasn't quicker or didn't or asked you to do so many clicks per movement. But I think that the gaming audience can sometimes be very, very generous, certainly when it comes to indie games, and which is really nice to see.
So you mentioned that you're working on a second game now. Is there anything that you're willing to say about it, or is it completely in a locked box for now?
It's in a lockbox for another couple of months while it cooks. But I don't know. I can only I love to tease about things. I think it's going to be I would be really interested to see, and I will have to ask you when it does get revealed, because I'd be very curious to see how it relates to people's expectations about what the what a person who made In Other Waters would make, because I think it plays with similar ideas, but it also exists in a different space. I think it's going to be really fun. I'm really excited to show it, because I think it's again an unusual game, but it's unusual in different ways, which is very fun for me. But I think it's still, it still really relies on those core ideas of text as a reward, and giving the player space, giving them a world where they can invest their imagination and their emotion, and that they can kind of meet me in the middle with. That's something that's definitely still there and still really going to be a driving force for people, I hope. In fact, more so, I really want it to be a game that people will be able to take their own path in, and find ways of engaging with it that fit with them. So it will be interesting to see if that plays out like I expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the Alien movie, actually. It's a good reference, because I remember watching that movie that there is so much kind of signalling of a wider universe in it. The company that they're working for, and the kind of the commute that they're on, and the job that they have, and the all of this different kind of, all of the references that come in, like the various authorities that they deal with. And there is always a suggestion of a wider world that you never quite, and a wider universe that you never quite get to see in that game. I had been curious after finishing In Other Waters if that universe was somewhere that you would stay, or if the next game would just be like a wipe the whiteboard clean and move on.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that In Other Waters is to me is such an individual project that when I kind of sit down and think about what I would add to it, or what a sequel would be, it just doesn't come to me. It feels very much its own. I like it as a self-contained thing, so I think that it will be interesting to see how people respond to future stuff. But it's amazing to have the opportunity to make a second game, really, and to be a kind of functioning one-person studio. I know that I'm in a very small percentage of first-time indie game makers who go on to make a second game. Obviously, it's not finished yet, but it's the outlook is good. So I feel very happy about that.
Okay, and where can people come and find you to get news of your projects, and to find Heterotopia, and to generally engage with what you're doing?
Yeah, the best place to find me is on Twitter, at JumpOverTheAge, or you can follow Heterotopias at HeterotopiasZN. It's kind of zine shortened down because there's not enough space on Twitter. There's also an at for In Other Waters as well. So you can select which of the many projects you want to stay, or if you just want to follow the main line along. And that's the first place I talk about anything. And if you want to be mercilessly teased about my next game, you can go to my Twitter account, and I will happily oblige. I'm terrible with secrets, but
I can imagine it's just burning a hole in your pocket. So thanks so much for talking about the game. It's been a real pleasure. It's a fascinating world, and I think I will go back. It's one of those games where I'm going to go back in and search every dot on the map until I've found it all, I think. It's a very soothing place to visit.
I'm really glad. Yeah, I'm really glad. And thank you for offering your thoughts. I love to hear people talk about this game still. I still am amazed that it works for people in a weird way, because it still feels like the kind of game that it's so linked to so many things that are very personal to me, and just my own obsessions, that it's just lovely to welcome people into that space of your own obsessions, and to see that they find it interesting. It's very rewarding. So it's been lovely to talk about it.
So that was a real pleasure to talk about In Other Waters. I truly love that game. It's available on Steam, and it's available on Switch. I played it on Switch. I played it on a big TV with the speakers turned up loud, and I feel like I found the optimal way to play it, although I understand from my friends over at The Short Game that they preferred to play it on a mouse. Either way, no matter how you play this game, I heartily recommend it. And if you do play it, please come and tweet at me at Gaming in the Wild. You can also find Gareth at In Other Waters and at Jump Over the Age. You're always welcome to come and support Gaming in the Wild via Patreon at patreon.com/gaminginthewild. I would also like to say thank you to Louis at TimePlayed3HR. He helped me out with a couple of audio issues with the podcast. So thank you to Louis, it made a big difference. I will also mention that the wonderful soundtrack of In Other Waters is available on Bandcamp. It's at amosroddy.bandcamp.com. And I will be back next week with a new show. I'm planning to talk to Adam from Switch Indie Fix about Immortals Phoenix Rising, although I'm still working my way through it, and I think Adam is much further ahead than I am, so I'm going to try and race through that before next week's episode. I'm also going to have Sam, aka at Clover_EXE on Twitter, a streamer and a gamer, and a really good guy on as a guest soon too. So there's lots to look forward to. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Take care of yourselves and each other. Bye bye for now.